Hello there and welcome to the Terrain and Environments Lab. In this lab, we're going to look at creating terrain and putting textures onto the terrain that we have created. We look at two common features that we put on terrain, which is trees and grass. We examine the various additional environment effects that we can add on to the terrain to make it look more realistic, such as a skybox, fog, lens flares, and water. And finally, we look at adding a character controller into the 3D environment that we have created so that we can navigate around in the environment. Now, let's start off by looking at terrain and textures. All 3D game levels have some form of an outdoor level, which is a kind of a simulation of a natural landscape in a world. And usually this terrain, this simulation, will have some kind of natural features such as a mountain, a hill, a lake, a meadow, a field, a swamp, and so on. In Unity, a terrain is modeled as a flat mesh that can be sculpted into many different shapes. So the idea of sculpting is you can somehow mold this mesh. You can think of the mesh that represents the terrain as a piece of plasticine or a piece of clay that you can somehow twist and turn and pull and compress into the shape that you want. So this is called sculpting. And you can sculpt the terrain into many different kinds of shapes, with the only limitation is that terrain cannot overlap. So you cannot have one terrain overhanging onto another terrain, like a cave, for example. But all terrain, just like any game objects, they have a position, a rotation, and a scale. So let's look and see how we can create the terrain in Unity. So I've got a new project open here. I'm going to now create a terrain game object. Go to the main menu, game object, create other, and then I select terrain. Okay, so now I have a large flat piece, a gray flat piece of material that's now on the scene view. And this is actually quite large. So what I'm going to do at the moment is I'm going to make it smaller. So to make it smaller, I'm going to click onto this button here. This button that looks like a wheel in the inspector view. Okay, and this gives me the terrain settings. And I go right down to the part that says resolution. I'm going to change the width to 200. Okay, and I'm going to change the terrain length to 200 as well. Okay, so as you can see, the scene view, this makes the size of the terrain slightly smaller and slightly more manageable, which makes it easier for us to work with it later on. Okay, now that we have created a terrain, the next thing we want to do is to add the impression of elevation to the terrain. Currently, the terrain is like a flat piece of land, like a large field where there is no bumps, there's nothing coming out from the ground, there's nothing going into the ground, everything is totally flat. But in a real environment, we want to have, the concept of things coming out from the ground, like a mountain, a hill, a plain, and we want to have the concept of something going into the ground, like a hole or a valley. Okay, so the size of and the shape of the things that are coming out from the ground and going to the ground can change, and they can be sculpted. To do this in Unity, we can start off using something called a height map. A height map is basically a image. It's a grayscale image, which means it doesn't contain any colors other than black and white. And the black and white in a grayscale image is used to represent the elevation information, similar to a topographical map. So a topographical map in geography is something that shows how high the current point in the map is from the base level or from the sea level. Okay, so some places may be below sea level, some places may be above sea level, and you want to know how much above sea level or how much below sea level is a particular point in a geographical map. So the height map is something that's used in Unity. It exists in a series of shades of gray that vary between white, which has the value of 255, and black, which has the value of 0. And it's basically an 8-bit image. So 2 to the power of 8 will give you 256. So you have altogether 256 shades of gray representing 256 different levels of elevation. Okay, oops, sorry. In Unity, the height maps must be grayscale images and they must be in the .raw format, which is a special format for importing height maps. And you can create this using Unity itself, or you can create them using quite a number of more well-known graphics editing applications that are already out there in the market. So let's see how we can import a height map to change the elevation of our currently flat terrain that we have in Unity. Let's go back to Unity, and let's go to let's go to the inspector view. Inspector view, and let's click on import raw. Go right down to the bottom, height map, import raw, and we go to terrain environment, the lab folder terrain environment, and you should see something called hour 4. If you open hour 4, you should see something called terrain.raw. Double click on that. You have a small dialog box that says import height map. Just click import, and boom, you've got an environment that's now been imposed. Okay, you've got a whole bunch of elevated terrain structures that you have imposed onto the originally flat structure. So you can pan around. Right now, if I click and alternate, I can just kind of move around and see how this flat piece of terrain looks like now that I have actually put a height map onto it. Okay, so this is how it looks like at the moment. Okay, just click here, drag the camera in a bit. So as you can see, it's a bit, all those cones that are sticking out from the ground, they're a bit too high. So what we're going to do now is to just adjust the height so they look more manageable. So again, I'm going to go back to the inspector view, click on the wheel, get the drop down options. I'm going to go to resolution, this area called resolution. I'm going to select terrain height. I'm going to change that to 200. So the size of the cones that are kind of sticking out from the ground now should reduce. Okay, as you can see, it becomes more manageable. And now you can play around with this value for terrain height to see how the maximum height of the terrain changes how the original topographical information from the height map is actually mapped onto your existing terrain that you created. Okay, so now it's a bit more easier to see. Let me just play around with it so that I can move it to a particular. Okay, so now I can move in and see the terrain a bit more close up. Okay. Now, there are various ways that I can sculpt the terrain. Okay, and I'm going to use the terrain sculpting tools, which is what you're going to see here. Okay, all these various tools they're going to use to sculpt the terrain. So the first tool that we're going to look at is actually the raise lower tool. It allows you to raise or lower the terrain. So I'm going to click on this icon here representing this tool. So it's highlighted and you see a bunch of brushes. So the brush is basically like a real life brush where you can actually paint the terrain in a specific way. Currently, the specific way selected is to raise or lower the terrain. So if I move the mouse now, you can see there's a kind of a light bluish tint that reflects the brush I'm using. If you play around with different brushes, you can see that the tint, the light blue tint on the scene view on the terrain, okay, reflects the particular shape of the brush I'm using. So you can play around with many different types of brushes, and you can see that they all have different shapes. Okay. Now let's work with a simple shape, which is a mid-sized circle. Now what happens is, with this particular functionality selected, I can either raise or lower the terrain, the elevation of the terrain. So if I hold down the left mouse button and I just kind of drag up, the terrain will go up. Okay, so it can be on any part of the terrain. I can make it go up. I can make it go up. Okay, I can hold and drag the mouse button left to right so that I can raise an entire patch of land so that it goes up, for example, like this. Okay. And I can use the shift button. So if I hold the left mouse button and also hold the shift key at the same time, I will actually lower the terrain. So for example here, if I hold the shift now, if I hold the shift, you can see the terrain is actually lowered. The terrain is actually lowered. I can lower this. I can lower this as well. So I'm lowering the terrain. I can lower the terrain simply by pressing the shift key. So holding down the shift key as well as sculpting with the left mouse button depressed will lower the terrain. Okay, without the shift key depressed, then the terrain will be heightened, will be raised. So you can play around with that and see how that works out. Okay. If you see here, the brush size determines the size of the brush. So currently, if you see here, it's like at this particular size. But if I increase the brush size to 85, you can see it's become larger as well. So this is one option if you want to increase the size of the brush. So you can select any particular brush that you want. For example, you can see the size of the brush is increased. Okay. If you want to make it smaller again, you make it smaller. So with a smaller brush size, obviously, the amount of land that you affect at one time is less. So you have more control, right? Like for example, here with a smaller brush size, I can actually pull up many small jagged cones from the ground. With a larger brush size, if I increase the brush size now in the inspector view to like about 84, then I have a larger brush size. When I increase a lot of things, a whole large piece of the terrain will be moved up at the same time. So if you want to sculpt at a final level of detail, minimize your brush size. If not, is increase the brush size. Depends on at what level of detail you want to work with in the scene. Okay, let me just make this smaller down a bit. I'm going to decrease the size of this. Okay. Okay, so decrease the size of this. Okay, now what else? Okay, let's look at the opacity. The opacity is used to determine how strong the sculpting effect is. So let's say if I have let's put a smaller brush size now in my inspector scene, and let's pick a smaller size circle now, and put a smaller opacity. Okay, so with a smaller opacity, the effect is not so pronounced. Okay, the effect is not so pronounced. And with a larger opacity, okay, the effect is more pronounced. Okay, it is more pronounced. So the opacity determines how strong the sculpting effect is. So when the opacity is very high, if I just drag the mouse just a bit, the cone will grow very fast in height. With the opacity very low, when I drag the mouse, the height of the cone will increase but very, very gradually. So it gives me more control over the level of detail and the height of the elevation that I want to effect on the current terrain. Okay. The next height is the next tool is called the paint height tool, and this tool that we see here, this second tool next to it. Now the paint height tool basically is to make when you hold down this particular when you hold down the left mouse button with this particular option selected, the terrain will be basically set to a fixed height. Okay, and so right now let's take a brush size, intermediate brush size of this. Maybe let's increase the brush size a bit. Now with this icon selected, now let's put it down here. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hold down the I'm going to hold down the shift key, and then at the same time I'm going to press the mouse button. Okay, then this is called sampling the target height. So now when I press it, okay, I can see the height goes to 0. When I press here, it says the height goes to 15.8394. When I press here, it says the height. Okay, can you see in the inspector view, you see the value of the height changes depending on where I put the brush now. So when I click here, the brush goes to 39.95. So what I'm doing is I'm getting the height of the particular structure that that the blue tinted circle is currently on, that my mouse is currently on. And the idea of sampling the height is once I've sampled the height, I can make everything else in that area to become exactly the same height as the sampled height. So it's like kind of making or flattening out everything, not necessarily flattening, but making everything in the area to a same uniform height. Okay, so let's come back to here. Now, right now at this, I've got kind of a flat area down here at the bottom. And if we sample the height here, I'm going to hold the left mouse button, I'm going to hold down the shift key and click the left mouse button, you see the height goes to 0. Now what I'm going to do now is hold the left mouse button down and just kind of drag it around, and you can see I'm lowering the height of everything here down to the height of 0. So everything now, see now I'm just going to hold it, Okay, the opacity, I'm going to increase it a bit so that it goes a bit faster. So now I hold it. See, everything goes down now. Okay, everything goes down now to a uniform height. Everything goes down to a uniform height. Okay, so that's the paint height tool. And then the final tool that we're going to look at is the smooth height tool, which is the next button or icon on the right. And this is used to basically smooth out the terrain. So currently the terrain looks a bit jagged. You want to make it more smooth so that it looks, you think of it like you're polishing off the work you have done. And this is very easy. Again, we just click on one of these brushes, and then if you see now, when I paint the environment, you see how it smooths out all the jagged edges. Can you see that? So now everything looks smoother. It looks more natural. Okay. So sometimes you want the environment to look more smoother. Sometimes you want the environment to look more jagged. So depending on your preferences, you use the smooth height tool for that purpose. Okay. Now I'm going to zoom out a bit first. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to create. Okay, so now we've got some rather jagged scenes here. I'm going to kind of play around and make it more smoother, and also have more elevations. So here, let me kind of get an elevation that's a bit higher and make everything high around here. I'm going to choose the sample height, and I'm going to sample the height here. No, I'm going to sample the height 6.632. I'm going to kind of make everything around here at this height. Okay, I'm going to kind of level everything out, level everything out, level everything out. Okay, level everything out, just not the edge. Level everything out. Okay, I'm just going to level it out so that I can build some kind of thing later on onto it. Level everything out to this particular height. Okay, so now I kind of have a flat plane here, and then here I can choose to have another flat pane at the top of here. So I'm going to sample, the current height is 6.653. I'm going to sample it here. Okay, wait. I'm going to sample it's 24. It's too high. Let me go down a bit. 9. Let's go up a bit. 19. 18. Okay, let's make it at 18. At 18, I'm going to kind of flatten everything out again. Flatten everything out. Okay, so now things look a bit more even. Okay, there's a bit more of flat land around. I'm going to just leave it like this first. Later on we can sculpt. Okay, so now I've done some sculpting. I've flattened out. I've got some planes here. So I've got like one elevation here. I can go up to this second elevation and then go up to the third elevation with a flat plane. So this will give our character some space to run about afterwards. Let me flatten out some of the other planes here. Let me just drag this a bit to the left. I'm going to again use the sampling tool here. This is at height 8.0. I'm just going to flatten everything out to 8.0. Flatten this out. Okay, everything is flattened out. I'm going to flatten out some of this. Okay. Then I'm going to set the height back to 0 and flatten out some of the ground here below. I'm going to flatten out some of this ground. Flatten it out. Flatten it out. Okay, flatten out, flatten out, flatten out, flatten out. Okay, so now it looks a bit more flat. Okay, I'm doing this because later on I'm going to start putting in different textures and trees and so on, so you want to be able to see that more clearly. Okay, so now I've flattened out the ground pretty much a bit, so you have large areas of plains around here. Now, let's go on to look at textures. Texturing a terrain means adding some kind of texture means it's some kind of look to your terrain so that the terrain looks more realistic. And texturing a terrain works like painting. You select a brush, a texture, and you paint it onto your world. And each game world that you have is unique, and each of them will require a custom texture to fit within the context of the games that you are working with. Okay. There are some general guidelines that we try to follow when you're working with textures. We try to make the pattern repeatable. So you have a texture of a grass. Okay, you want to have the same kind of pattern of grass repeated across the entire terrain. The larger the texture is, when you apply it, the less obvious a repeating pattern is. So you want to have the texture as large as possible. Obviously, to make a large texture is also very time consuming. So this is a trade-off between either having the texture to be very large, and then it looks more uniquely spread and more properly spread across the terrain that you're putting the texture on. If you make the texture very small, you have to keep repeating the same patch of texture, or the same block of texture over the entire terrain, and then the graphics, the appearance of the texture looks less realistic. It looks like something that's constantly repeating. So you have to decide what level of trade-off you want. You should try to make the texture square, because that makes it easier for Unity to plaster it across your terrain, and make the texture a dimension of a power of 2. For example, to the power of 3, to the power of 4, to the power of 5, and so on. And these two guidelines, making the texture square and making the texture dimension a power of 2, helps to affect the compression of the texture and the texture's efficiency. This is related to how the Unity texture processing engine actually works to generate and render the textures. Keep the effects subtle in the texture, meaning you try to make it not too obvious, and the idea is you want to have the elements to transition from one texture to another without a harsh transition. So let's say you're moving in a grassy area and you're moving into a hilly area. You don't want to have an area, you don't want to have a transition where for 1 minute you have a lot of grass, and then the next minute you don't have any grass at all and you have a lot of hill. You want it to be transitioning nicely so that it goes from one element to another naturally, so the environment looks more realistic. Okay, so let's see how this is done. Let's look at terrain texture. So we're going to go to assets, and we're going to say import package, and then we're going to say terrain assets. We're going to click on terrain assets, and then it comes out the importing package dialog box. We're going to click on import. Okay, and it imports. Okay, and now you should have an additional folder in your assets main folder in your project view called standard assets, and within that you've got terrain assets. And you've got a whole bunch of terrain assets, terrain for grass, terrain textures. So you have grass, and grass 2, cliff, good dirt, grass, hill, grass and rock, trees, ambient occlusion. You've got palm trees. We're going to look at how we're going to introduce palm trees in the environment later on. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is to actually apply the texture to the terrain of your choice. Okay, so we go back to the terrain that we selected just now. This is the terrain we selected, and then to load a texture, okay, we go to this particular tool here, select that. Okay, so this tool is called painting the texture. And once you've selected that, you have a whole bunch of options here. Click on edit textures, then you click on add texture, then the add terrain texture dialog box will appear. Then you select, okay, and then you select grass hill, because a lot of the area here is hilly. Okay, then you click add, and now you should see that your terrain now basically has got this texture plastered all the way. Okay. Now let's zoom in a bit to the scene so we can see it a bit more close up. Okay. So let's zoom in a bit. Okay, let's zoom in a bit here. We'll zoom into the scene here. So we already have got some texture applied. So now you see that you've got grass, hill grass all over the place. But you might want to have, for example, to make it more realistic, you want to make sure that the grass on the cliff side, on the sides of the cliff, don't actually look so green. They look more bare, they look more brown because there's more soil here. Okay, so to do that, we can now add another texture. So we go through the same process again. We click on the painting texture button. We click edit texture, click add texture, click select. Now we select something called grass and rock. So this is a mixture of grass and rock. Previously we selected grass hill, which is a lot of grass. Now we select something called grass and rock. We click add. So now we select the grass and rock texture. We select an appropriate brush. So let's take a smaller size brush here. And now we can, okay, this brush is too large. Let's take a smaller size. Okay, now we can actually paint. Okay, can you see now I'm painting? Just hold your left mouse button now and click and drag. And so you can see that the sides of the hill now, the texture is now slightly different. It's no longer the same green texture. Okay, so now I'm painting it, and the painting effect should come into place. So you can see that. So now that I finished painting, if I just go out a bit, you can see that the effect is quite noticeable. Here it's all green. Okay, here it's all green. Here it's all green, and here you have that texture that we selected just now, which is the grass hill texture. Okay, sorry, the grass and rock texture. So the texture has changed. So you can change the texture in a similar way. You can select another kind of texture and apply, for example. Add another texture, select. Let's say you want good dirt, or you want cliff layer. Cliff layer then looks really like a rock. So I select cliff layer. Okay, I click add. Now again I select. Now if I apply this to, for example, here. Now you see that texture is now completely different already. You can see it looks really rocky. Okay, so I've actually applied 3 different layers. One is originally all hilly, all grass. Then one is grass and rock, and now one is actually a cliff surface texture. And you can see, if you move in, you can see that the transitions between all these different textures are done quite smoothly by Unity, so that it's not terribly obvious to the viewer. Okay. So you can play around with the different textures available and try and sculpt your environment in any particular form you want. Again, this is pretty much an art form, so there is no particular technique. You have to just keep playing around and get a feel for the environment and see what kind of texture and look looks good for your environment, for your terrain. Okay, let's continue. Okay, let's look at trees and grass. So adding trees and grass to the terrain is very similar to sculpting and texturing that we saw earlier just now. And with trees, there is something called a whopping effect, which is how the rendering engine in Unity works. In order to minimize the load on the performance of the engine, sometimes you may see trees bending and changing. And this is meant to make the project run faster due to the way that the rendering engine in Unity works. When the trees are very far away from the viewer, so when your imaginary camera pans very far away from the scene, the trees will be rendered as what is called a lower quality billboard. And when the viewer gets closer, the trees are swapped with higher quality versions. So when you come in, when you scroll in, when your imaginary camera moves in closer in the scene, you can see a high quality tree. Okay, let's see how we can add trees and grass. Let's go back to Unity again. Let me just pan out a bit. Okay, so we're out a bit now. Okay, now we go to this button here and we click it, and we have reached the place trees functionality in the terrain transform component. And right now we want to add a tree. So let's click on edit trees, click on add tree. Okay, yeah, add tree dialog box comes out. You go to this tiny little circle on the right of the text field that says none game object. Click on that. You should have currently a palm tree available. This is something that you imported just now when you imported the terrain asset. So double click on that and then click add. Okay, so now you've got the palm tree, which you can now start putting in to the environment. So the size of the brush now is pretty large. So when I click here, if I have to click on the scene, then the trees will be placed into this particular terrain at this given density. So I'm going to make the brush size a bit smaller first, okay? And I'm going to make the tree density quite high. Currently, I've set the tree density to about 91. So what happens now is in this small little brush, in this area where you are currently seeing the circle, let me make the circle maybe a bit larger. Okay, let's make it a bit larger. Circle for, make the brush size a bit larger. Okay, so now when I click the left mouse button, trees are going to be placed in the radius of the circle in that density level that has been set in the inspector view. Okay, so if I click here, you can see there are many trees that are appearing. You can click here, there are many trees that are appearing. Okay, many trees because the density is high. If I want the density be low, I can drag this down. So now if I set the density to about 21, okay, now let's try putting it somewhere here. So now the tree density is at 21. So if I left click, you see the number of trees is much smaller. Much smaller. Scroll out again, much smaller. Okay, so I can control the amount of trees that are appearing randomly with this tree density. Okay, and I can remove the trees by pressing the shift key, or holding the shift key down in order to erase the trees. So let me make my brush size a bit smaller first to 25, or maybe even 22. Okay, so now at 22, if I hold down the left shift key, I'm actually erasing all the trees. So you can see all the trees have been erased. I'm erasing the trees. So all the trees have been erased from the scene. I can also use mass place trees. This option allows me to create. You can see that the dialog box place trees comes up. I can choose the number of trees that I'm going to put onto the current terrain now, and they'll be put randomly across the entire terrain. So I'm going to put the size as say I want to have 50 trees. Okay, immediately 50 trees will appear randomly across the terrain. Click place, you got 50 trees appearing across the terrain. I'm going to erase all these trees again. Erase the trees. Okay, now maybe if I want to have even more trees, I say mass place trees and choose say 150 trees placed. Got 150 trees randomly placed in the environment, which you can now see. Okay, again I'm going to erase the trees. Sorry, hold left shift key down. I'm going to erase the trees. Okay, so let's mass place trees. Let's mass place trees, and let's use a tree density of like 43, slightly higher brush size. I'm gonna paint a couple of trees here, maybe here. Okay, so now we've got a whole bunch of trees down there in the environment, and we can actually zoom in and see the trees close up if you want to. Okay. And as you can see, when you come in closer, I'm going to go back up to here. You can actually see the tree more clearly, more close up by panning around with the imaginary camera. You can see how the trees look like. Okay.